April 7th, 1945. The East China Sea. Look at this explosion. Most historians mistake this photo for a tactical nuclear test. It isn't. This is the death rattle of a single ship. When the magazine of the battleship Yamato detonated, the blast was seen 100 miles away in Kagoshima. The shockwave reportedly destroyed American aircraft flying above it. This wasn't just a sinking, it was the violent end of an era. The IJN Yamato. She wasn't just a warship, she was a national shrine made of steel. 72,800 tons fully loaded. Armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a floating vessel. Each shell weighed as much as a Cadillac. Each turret weighed more than an entire American destroyer. She was built to rule the waves. She was built to be unsinkable. But on her final mission, she wasn't sent to win a battle. She was sent to die.
Spring 1945. The Empire of Japan is collapsing. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, is at the bottom of the ocean. The Americans have landed on Okinawa, the very doorstep of the Japanese mainland. In Tokyo, the mood is apocalyptic. The army is preparing Ketsu-go, the decisive battle on home soil. They are training civilians to fight with bamboo spears. During a briefing about the defense of Okinawa, Emperor Hirohito asked a simple question that would seal the fate of thousands of men. He looked at his admirals and asked, "But what about the Navy? Are there no ships left?" It was an innocent question, but in the culture of Imperial Japan it was interpreted as a command. The Navy had to do something. They couldn't let the army die alone on Okinawa while the great Yamato sat safely in port. Honor demanded a sacrifice. So the High Command drafted Operation 10-Go. The plan was madness. The Yamato, accompanied by a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, would sail to Okinawa. She would plow through the American fleet. She would beach herself on the coast of Okinawa, and there, stranded like a beached whale, she would use her massive guns as invincible artillery batteries to support the troops until she was destroyed. Vice Admiral Shichi Ito, the mission commander, called the plan exactly what it was: an erratic suicide run. But the order came from the Emperor. There was no refusal.
April 5th. The preparations began. The Yamato needed fuel. Japan was so starved of oil that they had to scrape the bottom of the barrels from other ships and storage tanks. They managed to load enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa. There was rumors they loaded enough to return, but everyone on board knew the truth. You don't return from a mission like this. The mood on the ship was a mix of samurai stoicism and tragic sorrow. The sick were ordered off the ship. The youngest naval cadets, boys of 15 and 16, were forcibly removed. They begged to stay and die with their ship, but the officers threw them onto the supply boats. You are the future of Japan, they were told. Live to rebuild. That night, a farewell party was held. Captain Aruga opened the ship's store of sake. The sailors drank, sang naval songs, and wrote their final letters home. Ensign Yoshida Mitsuru, who survived, later wrote, "We were like cherry blossoms waiting to fall. There was a strange beauty in knowing exactly when you would die. They cut locks of their hair and fingernails, placing them in envelopes, so their families would have something to bury if their bodies were lost at sea."
April 6th, 1945, 4 p.m. The Yamato and her 9 escorts slipped out of the inland sea. They hoped to stay undetected as long as possible. But the Americans were everywhere. Waiting in the murky waters were the U.S. submarines Threadfin and Hackleback. They saw the behemoth. They didn't attack. Their torpedoes would just scratch the paint of such a monster. Instead, they radioed the coordinates. Target confirmed. Yamato heading south. The message reached Admiral Raymond Spoonance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. He had a choice. He could send his own battleships to engage the Yamato in a classic gun duel. The old battleship admirals wanted this. They wanted a knight's duel. But Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the aircraft carriers of Task Force 58, had a different idea. He wanted to prove, once and for all, that the age of the battleship was over. He radioed Spoonance, "Will you take them, or shall I?" He didn't wait for an answer. He launched everything. Task Force 58 launched a swarm. 280 aircraft in the first wave alone. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. More planes were launched against this single ship than were used in the entire Battle of Britain. The pilots were given simple instructions. Ignore the escorts. Get the big one.
April 7th, 12:30 p.m. On the bridge of the Yamato, the radar operator called out, "Contact." Not one blip, not 10. The screen was a solid wall of light. The lookouts raised their binoculars. The sky was black with dots, like a plague of locusts. Admiral Ito looked up. He knew this wasn't a battle. This was an execution. He ordered, "Open fire." The Yamato's main guns fired Sun-Shiki shells, special anti-aircraft rounds that exploded like giant shotgun shells filled with incendiary tubes. The sky lit up with fire. But the American planes were too fast, too many, and too hungry. The first Hellcat fighter tipped its wing and dove. The slaughter had begun.
The first wave hit at 12:37 p.m. The Americans didn't attack randomly. They were methodical. They were surgeons with explosives. The dive bombers went first, aiming for the decks to destroy the anti-aircraft guns and blind the radar. 2 bombs struck near the main mast. The radar room was pulverized. The Yamato was now blind. Then came the Avengers, the torpedo bombers. They had learned from history. They knew if they hit both sides of the ship, she would just sink lower but remain upright. So they concentrated their attacks on the port side. They wanted to make her roll over. 3 torpedoes slammed into the port hull. A great ship shuddered. She began to list 5 degrees, then 6 degrees. Inside the command center, the officers faced a horrific choice. The ship was tilting too much. To fix it, they had to counterflood, pump water into the starboard side to balance the weight. But the pumps were too slow. So the order was given to open the flood valves on the starboard engine rooms and boiler rooms. The problem? There were hundreds of men still inside those rooms working the engines. There was no time to warn them. The valves were opened. Hundreds of Japanese engineers and stokers were drowned by their own commanders to buy the ship a few more degrees of stability. The ship leveled out, but the speed dropped. The beast was limping.
It didn't matter. At 1 p.m., the second wave arrived. At 1:45 p.m., the third wave arrived. The Yamato was a floating target practice. Her massive 18-inch guns were useless against agile planes. The Sanshiki anti-aircraft shells actually damaged the gun barrels more than they damaged the enemy. The Americans were relentless. They circled like wolves around a dying buffalo. By 2 p.m., the Yamato had taken at least 8 bomb hits and 11 torpedo hits. Most ships would have sunk after 3 torpedoes. The Yamato took 11 and was still fighting. But she was a wreck. The port list was back, worse than ever. 15 degrees. The rudder was jammed hard to port. The ship was stuck in a death spiral, turning in a massive circle in the ocean. On the bridge, Vice Admiral Ito stopped the struggle. He knew it was over. He canceled the mission. He ordered the remaining destroyers to pick up survivors. Then he shook hands with his officers and retired to his private cabin to die with the ship. Captain Aruga, the ship's master, had himself tied to the binnacle on the bridge. He would not leave his post. At 2:20 p.m., the list reached 90 degrees. The Yamato lay down on her side. The massive 18-inch gun turrets, held in place only by gravity, fell out of their mountings. As the ship rolled completely upside down, the ammunition magazines for the main guns shifted. Inside the bowels of the ship, fires reached the main magazines. What happened next was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. The ship didn't just sink, it vaporized. A pillar of fire shot 2,000 feet into the air. A mushroom cloud rose 20,000 feet, visible from the Japanese mainland over 100 miles away. The explosion was so violent, it killed American pilots flying above. It killed hundreds of Japanese sailors who had managed to jump into the water. Then silence returned to the East China Sea. Where the 70,000-ton monster had been, there was only a patch of bubbling oil and charred debris. Of the 3,332 men on board the Yamato, only 276 survived.
Vice Admiral Ito went down with the ship. The unsinkable symbol of the Empire lasted less than 2 hours against the power of naval aviation. The sinking of the Yamato was more than just a naval victory for the U.S. It was the final period at the end of a sentence written in steel. For centuries, nations believed that the bigger the ship, the more powerful the navy. The battleship was the king of the sea. On April 7, 1945, the king was dead. The aircraft carrier had taken the throne. Today, the Yamato lies 1,100 feet down. She is broken in two, a silent tomb for 3,000 men. In Japan, she is still remembered, not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of sacrifice, a tragedy of men who obeyed orders they knew were impossible. They sailed into the fire simply because they were asked to. This was the story of the biggest ship in history and its final desperate journey. If you enjoyed this deep dive into naval history, please like and subscribe. I'm Channel Name, and I'll see you in the next documentary.